What we're going to do today is look at ASCE 7-10. This is the new version. You can see that by looking at the other versions of ASCE 7 that it's bigger. It's new. And this isn't really that new in a way. This has been out since April of this year, somewhere around there it's been out, but nobody's paid any real attention to it because it's not in the codes yet. And the building code, which is International Building Code, it refers to 05. The new version comes out 2012. And in 2012, it's going to refer to ASCE 7-10. And when do we expect that? It's probably going to be early in the year. In other words, maybe February or March, somewhere in there, we'll have the new code. This is 09. It'll be 2012 IBC. So we want to look at the new version and compare it to the 05. They look a lot alike, but it's billed as the most significant change to ASCE 7 since 1995. 1995 was the time that we switched to 3-second gust speeds instead of fastest mile wind speeds. So this is a significant change, but it's a significant change in a lot of areas besides wind. And as you're probably well familiar, the document carries a lot of information that is not wind resistance of roof. And the biggest expansion in 10 is really in the seismic area, earthquakes. And there's differences all through the book. It's reorganized, and it's considerably larger than the older version. This has got 600 pages compared to about 400. And it's not in the wind area for roofing. It's in a lot of different areas. Just before we get started on the differences, I'm going to recap real quickly wind design according to ASCE 705. And the basic equation for the wind uplift pressure, uplift, is going to be the velocity pressure times the exterior coefficient and the interior pressure coefficient together, and you'll end up with the uplift pressure. Most of the changes in 10, ASCE 7-10, occur in this area, which is velocity pressure. Now, velocity pressure is going to be looking at a constant times the exposure coefficient times the directional coefficient times the coefficient that adjusts for terrain. Unusual terrains like being on a cliff or an isolated hill, times an importance factor times velocity squared. And one of the important things in there to look at is velocity is squared. But once you end up with that, working that calculation, you will be calculating the pressure of the wind against an object at the height of the roof. And that can be expressed in Q sub H or Q sub Z. They're both the same as far as wind design is concerned. But what you're calculating is the velocity pressure against the building at the height of the roof. The next thing that you do is convert that velocity pressure into uplift pressure in 3 zones on the roof. The field of the roof has the lowest uplift pressure, and the perimeter second lowest, and the corners have the highest uplift pressure. And these numbers for GC sub P, this factor right here, is either going to be negative 1.0 or a negative 1.4, depending on how tall the building is. There's a break point at 60 feet. You know, buildings above 60 feet are going to be, in the field of the roof, is a negative 1.4, and you can see how that works. This doesn't really change in ASCE 7-10. That's going to be the same in that area. There will be some changes that just happen because of just small changes in the method of calculating. The third step in calculating pressure is to identify this product right here, which is the internal pressure coefficient. Internal pressure coefficient is a result of wind blowing against a building, leakage into the building that's greater than leakage out. So pressure builds up, it goes up through the deck and acts on the membrane and adds to the uplift created by the wind passing over the top and creating suction on the membrane. This is only going to be one of 3 values. If it's an open building, meaning there's no walls on the floor immediately below the roof, it's 0, so it doesn't really affect the value. But there has to be a definition of whether it's enclosed or it's partially enclosed. And partially enclosed is one where windows have been blown out in a storm, or there are large openings in a building, and that creates additional pressure on the inside, creating additional pressure, uplift pressure on that roof. So the definition of these two becomes important. That's a pretty big factor in the design of the uplift pressure on the roof system. So those are the 3 basic steps, regardless of whether you're in 05 or in 10, except a little difference in 05 as we'll go through. So what's new about ASCE 7-10? And in a word, it's the Windspeed maps. Now, if you've opened that book, you'll kind of take a step back and say, those are considerably different wind pressures than I'm used to, or wind velocities. And the first thing I did after opening that book and looking at the maps is to say, wow, I wonder if they've changed the formula. So you look at the formula, and it hasn't changed that much. They've substituted 3 wind pressure maps for 1 map, and they've taken out the importance factor, but the numbers are going to be quite a bit higher. You know, as we go through this, you'll find that that really gets canceled out in the end. So we have 3 different maps with different velocities instead of having an importance factor. So without an importance factor, we just choose the right map. It sounds pretty simple because most everything else is the same. This is the familiar ASCE 7-05 map, and that shows the wind velocities in the major part of the U.S., and then this is the hurricane-prone region where the hurricanes come in offshore. In the ASCE 7-10, we have the roof, this is the risk index, and we have a category 1, a category 2, and a category 3 and 4 wrapped in this 3rd map. All of these maps have the same contour lines on them, but the wind velocities are higher on one than they are on the other. So we're going to end up with 3 different maps instead of 1 map, and we don't have an importance factor in the equation. And that's the main difference in that system. So look at the wind velocities and see how they compare. We have ASCE 705, where the main part of the U.S., now remember that the 3 states on the west coast are 85 miles an hour. The main part of the U.S. is 90 miles per hour wind. And then you end up with hurricane-prone regions running from 90, above 90 to 150. That's what we're used to in 05. In 10, importance factor 1, or in this case, it's going to be risk category 1, using that map, the main part of the U.S. 105, Pacific coast is at 100, and then we end up with 105 to 170. Now that value can go up to 200 miles an hour in risk categories 3 and 4. So these are substantially higher winds in these cases. And the winds actually correlate with the recurrence interval. Now you're familiar with that in the ASCE 705. Category 2 is going to be our 50-year recurrency interval. That's 50-year recurrency interval will be on ASCE 705 map. But when we go to ASCE 710, even in risk category 1, we'll end up with a mean recurrence interval of 300 years. And you go into the standard building, which is not a high-risk building and it's not a low-risk building, you're at 700 years, and in 3 and 4, 1,700 years. Dave?
Jerry, is it going to be the local code officials that determine which category they want to apply for the particular regions?
The question has to do with who determines what category you're going to be on, and that's a good question. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on that because the definition is not nearly as clearly defined in ASCE 10 as it was in 05, but you're going to have to make that decision probably with an owner. Why the higher wind speeds? This is probably one of the most important slides in this presentation, just to get your head around what is happening here. In ASCE 705, these were basic wind speed map, had a 50-year recurrency interval, and it was appropriate risk for components and cladding. These are things that adhered to a structural element that is not going to fail. When these wind speeds were used for strength design, you'd have to go further than that at the end for the strength of the building and multiply it times 1.6. And most of us are not involved in strength design. So we've never seen this part of it. But we'll use the 50-year recurrency interval, and if you're designing the structure itself, you'll multiply it times 1.6. In the new version, we're using strength-designed wind speeds. And these are used to calculate wind pressures on the main wind force resistant system. And the load factor is 1.0. Instead of having a load factor of 1.6, we have a load factor of 1.0. But in the components and cladding, the calculated wind pressure is multiplied by a load reduction factor of 0.6. And that's because we're using ultimate wind speeds for strength design, but we're using a lesser wind speed actually for components and cladding, and that adjustment at the end is going to be a 0.6 multiplier. Any questions about that side? This is found in Chapter 2. It's not really clearly stated. It's unfortunate that it's not as clear as it is, but for those who use ASCE 7 for whole building design, this is a lot more familiar to them, because you'd never build a building to a load factor where the structure would have a wind exceeding that once every 50 years. I mean, you're going to build that building so that it never blows down, period. And that's what they're used to doing, and multiplying the value with the old map by 1.6. So the change in equation is in the velocity pressure area. This is velocity pressure at height h, which is the height of the building. And you'll see that the same constant, same values. This is 05. In the 10 version, the same equation, except you don't see the importance factor anymore. Two things have changed. The importance factor has been dropped, replaced by basic wind speeds, and the basic wind speeds have increased. So we've got higher wind speeds, but we no longer have that importance factor. The rest of the equation, the basic major equation, uplift pressure, velocity pressure, times the coefficient for internal pressure or external pressure and internal pressure, that remains exactly the same. But this is the part that has changed. And there's some subtleties that are also affecting these two as well. But we'll go through those and just see how they affect that area. You had asked the question about about who chooses the risk factor. Well, there are definitions. In 05, these are the major definitions for the three importance factors. It's occupancy category 1, buildings that represent low hazard to human life. That's going to remain the same. Category 2 says anything that's not 1 or 3 or 4 is in 2. It still is going to be there. But occupancy 3 and 4 were carefully defined. Now I'm going to go through those definitions, even though it's a little bit laborious, but go through the definitions to show how you would be told pretty much in 05 whether it's a category 3 or 4 or a category 2. So we have a lot of carefully defined building types that pose extra risk to people or contents of the building. In 07, we call 07-10, they're now called risk categories. The definitions of 1 and 2 remain the same as in the 05 version. Now, we're still talking about agricultural buildings, buildings that do not house people and create little risk to the occupants. That's going to be one. And two is things that don't fall into either one. It's the definitions of 3 and 4 that change. So let's look at just the definitions of 3 and 4 for ASCE 7-05. They talk about buildings that house more than 300 people in one area. I can remember in our classes we go through that definition and try to define in a building like this building, would you expect 300 people to be located in one area? That's going to be a question. Is it a daycare facility? And if so, does it have a capacity greater than 150? If not, it's going to be a category 2. If it does, it's category 3. Elementary or secondary schools with a capacity greater than 250. Colleges or adult education facilities with a capacity greater than 500. Healthcare facilities that do not have surgery or emergency characteristics with a capacity of 50 or more patients fall into category 3. What I'm trying to describe here is just how well defined these categories are in the 05 version. And then we'll go look at 10 and see how that compares. Jails or detention facilities also fall into category 3. Power generation statements, water treatment, sewage treatment facilities, telecommunications, they list them all as being appropriate to end up in category 3. Category 4, hospitals or healthcare facilities having surgery or emergency treatment facilities. The difference between category 3 and 4 has to do with seismic design. It really doesn't affect roofing. They're either going to be 3 and 4 together. They don't change. Fire, rescue, ambulance, police stations, emergency vehicle garages, designated earthquake, hurricane, other emergency shelters. You can read through here pretty much and see how defined these areas are in the 05 version. Now you take the 10 ASCE 7-10 and the risk category 3 definition is a lot more general. It says buildings that could pose a substantial risk to human life, whatever that is. I mean, that's going to be up to you to decide that. Buildings with potential to cause substantial economic impact or a mass disruption of day-to-day activities. What does that mean? I think you can start going through and seeing some of the same categories in the old one, but not necessarily. Buildings that store toxic or explosive substances of sufficient quantity to pose a threat to the public. So we're beginning to get a feel for what they look at as category 3. Category 4 are essential buildings, whatever designated essential buildings are. The buildings, if the failure of the building could pose a substantial hazard to the community, containing sufficient quantities of toxic substances, and if these are structures required to maintain the functionality of other risk category 4 structures. Now think about that. We're talking about perhaps, I used to work for Dow Chemical. Well, Dow Chemical has a plant in Texas that does produce some pretty hazardous stuff. So the building that this is where the product is made is going to have a roof system that is designed for category 4. But then there's the plant office, the main office. That's going to have to be designed too, because we have structures required to maintain the functionality of other risk category 4 structures. So you might throw that in. And then of course we have the administration building in Midland, Michigan for Dow. And if we had a hurricane in Texas that's going to wipe out a plant, we certainly want those people in Midland to be able to control what's going on and when to evacuate the plant and so on. So do you design that building also, even though it's an office building? You might. It's going to be a judgment at some particular point as to what that means. The definitions of occupancy categories 3 and 4 in 05 are much more definitive than they are in the 10 version. And this may lead to involvement of the owner in the building design. It may be that many of you will specify in the category that's a higher risk just to avoid a misinterpretation. What do you do today with a warehouse office structure that's being designed for a future tenant? It's designed to be built and then leased out and then later sold. We generally make the same decisions in this case as we have in the past, only now the definitions are kind of gray. And how do you know whether somebody's going to occupy that building that does have hazardous materials? You really don't know. So you talk to an owner, and during the design phase, if you can, and say, do you want to design this for clients that might have hazardous materials? And then you get it in writing. Obviously, it's the same scenario, but it changes things with the new definitions that are not definitive. Another change that has occurred, if you look at the 05 map, this is not as clear here, but it is as clear in the book. It just didn't show up that way on the slide. But we're showing the counties, and we're showing the special wind regions and the mountainous areas. But the thing that's really changed is that the ISO bars that show the wind velocity decaying from the hurricane have been moved closer to the ocean. And what they found is that hurricanes, when they hit landfall, die more rapidly than they used to think. So the 10 version, all the maps are different. They do not show the same amount of time that the hurricane travels inland as they did in the 05 area and 10. Buildings previously in a hurricane zone may no longer be in a hurricane zone. For instance, buildings in this area here, which is a lot of population, they were in a hurricane zone. They may not be in a hurricane zone anywhere on that edge of that map. So in some ways, this has reduced the wind velocity. Wind-borne debris regions. Now, if you recall, wind-borne debris regions are regions within a hurricane-prone area that that have the potential of carrying wind-borne debris and blowing out windows. And in a wind-borne debris region, you have to design the windows to be resistant to this debris blowing against that building. The same definition occurs in ASCE 7-10, but the wind velocities are higher because we're using a higher wind map. But other than that, we're still in the same situation. We define the hurricane-prone region, but within the hurricane-prone region, we define the wind-borne debris region. You need to use the correct risk category map. And you have to look underneath the definition of the wind-blown debris region to understand which map to use. And it's not, even that is not as clear as you would think. You would think that if you were going to put it in, if you're going to have a risk category 3 for a building, therefore you'd use that map when you're defining wind-borne debris. But it isn't quite that simple. It's for risk category 2 buildings and structures and risk category 3 buildings and structures, except healthcare facilities. They're going to base it on the risk category 2 basic wind speed. And then for risk category 3 health facilities and risk category 4, we're going to use the 3 and 4 basic wind speed map. I know this is a little bit more detail than you want to go through at this particular point, but just remember that to read those definitions so that you're using the right map. And we have the same instructions on glazing. The glazing does not need to be protected or designed to be debris resistance for category 1 buildings and for glazing over 60 feet above the ground, 30 feet above aggregate roofs that are within 1,500 feet. This is based on the hurricane problems that we had in Houston recently, where a lot of stone was blown off a building, carried in the wind and blew out windows. Same definitions occur. We haven't changed the definitions. But look what the effect of the correct wind speed has on determining the wind-borne debris regions. This darker area here shows the wind-borne debris region that would occur under a risk category 2 using the definition. If you have a risk category 3 and 4, that should be a 3, you'll see that the wind-borne debris region is different. Now in the 05 version, you had one map, and once you defined the wind-borne debris region, it was the same for all importance factors. In this category, the way this is handled, you pick the wrong map, and you'll end up putting a lot more buildings within that total area of wind-borne debris. This probably doesn't have much of an effect on, well, it does have an effect on new construction, but especially on older buildings. You take a new building, according to the International Building Code, it has to have glazing that is resistant to wind-borne debris within those regions. So somebody's going to be thinking this thing through and determining what categories that's in. When I'm talking about somebody, I'm talking about the building designer. But in re-roofing, you're the guy. You know, you're going to be defining what category, which map to be using, and it can have a substantial effect on a lot of these areas as to how they're designed, and that affects, of course, the internal pressure coefficient. Because once you define the internal pressure coefficient, it's going to be based on whether the windows are blown out or whether they're secure. So this has quite a major effect. So how do you locate your building accurately? In the 05 version, we have a map that is blown up in the hurricane areas so you can more closely identify where the building is. But it doesn't show cities, it doesn't show roads, but at least you have a county, and you can locate the building within that county. And the 10 version, it only has the distance map. In other words, you're going to have half of the U.S. on one map, and it shows the counties across. It doesn't show the state lines, it doesn't show highways. It's getting more difficult. But if you showed all the blow-up areas, you'd end up with 3 maps, and then you'd end up with the blow-up areas as well. You'd have a lot of maps in the ASCE 7. So where did you go? Well, this is kind of a useful tool, and that is going to atcouncil.org/windspeed. Now, this organization was set up by engineers and designers primarily on the West Coast initially, and they were trying to define exactly where the earthquake hazards were and where they had to design buildings differently from a seismic load standpoint. But eventually, they also had wind in there, and they spread wind and earthquakes across the U.S. This is funded in part by one of the major sponsors, the ASCE, but there's several organizations that have funded this source of data. And it's free to the user. So you can go on this on a wind site, and this is the report that you will get. The report shows the latitude and longitude, and if you have that, rather than defining the location of the building, you just put in the latitude and longitude in the previous page, and it will define where that building is and what the wind speeds are. It gives the wind speeds for ASCE 7-10, risk category 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and it shows it without having to extrapolate between the contours like we normally do. It'll tell you exactly what the wind speed is at that location, and it shows the mean recurrency interval for 07 maps, and it will show the value there for the 05. So you have a lot of data on there just by locating that building. This map is a typical Google map, and you can zero in, get closer and closer. We'll show the streets. You can put the building on the street that you want it on, and it will tell you what the latitude and longitude is, or you can drive to a site and read it off your GPS in the car. You know, as long as you have those values, or you can pinpoint where it is, you have the wind speeds. Now, if you're in a special wind speed area, meaning places where they have speed up of wind, like mountain areas or something, it will tell you to see the building official. It won't give you the wind value. But other than that, even places like Granby, up in the mountains, it tells you what the wind speed design is for that area. So it's quite interesting, and I would encourage you to use that to identify the wind speed in a given area. Change in exposure categories. Remember that K sub H is the coefficient that adjusts for building height and surrounding terrain. We've used that for a long time. This is the area that has really changed, and that's surface roughness exposure C and D in hurricane areas. In the 05 version, it states that buildings located adjacent to water surfaces in the hurricane-prone regions are included in surface C. Now, if you remember why that is, it's because people have considered the waves to be 30 feet high in a hurricane on the ocean, and that these would act like 30-foot-high buildings and roughen up the air. So we would not put them in D, we'd leave them in C. But now they've found that hurricanes die more rapidly, but also when they're going over water, the roughness of the waves really doesn't affect it. So it now goes in category D. That can be a considerably higher wind uplift pressure. So if you're designing anything located along the ocean in a hurricane-prone region, you could have substantially higher values because you're now going to be in smooth water exposure. I'm going to look at it as category D. There are other changes just in the way that it's put together, and that is that we have a simplified procedure in ASCE 7-10 that covers buildings up to 160 feet instead of just up to 60 feet. So we've got more tables, more definition. There are more building profiles in ASCE 7-10 than there was in 05. That means like domed, sawtooth, all the different profiles getting the K sub H. And the organization will throw you. It'll take some getting used to. In ASCE 7-05, everything was for wind was in chapter 6. Now we've separated into two major chapters, and then there are other pieces in different areas. For instance, risk category is defined in chapter 1. It applies to all buildings, structures, structural design, as well as wind design. And so you'll have to get used to the organization of the book. But once you get used to it, it's pretty efficient. There's really nothing wrong with it. It just takes a little time to get used to how it's organized. So what's the net effect? Are we going to have higher uplift pressures, lower uplift pressures? What's the net effect of going from ASCE 705 to 10? This is the same equation. This is going to be considerably higher. That is, the velocity pressure will be higher due to higher wind speeds. And the GC sub PI may be higher due to risk category and need for protective glazing. So it depends on how you choose your wind maps. The velocity pressure equation is the same one we looked at before without the importance factor. It's going to be significantly higher for the velocity pressure. The velocity pressure will be significantly higher due to the use of strength design wind maps. It could change significantly when you're near an ocean because of the definition of the exposure categories. It could change due to the enclosure classification. If you're in a wind-blown debris region in one map and you're not in another, it could change it considerably. And it could change just by a conservative choice of a risk category. And that is because it's not as well defined, you may put things into a risk category 3 or 4 that you would previously put into a risk category 2. So that's kind of where the thing is as far as the net effect on the on the changes. For the mainland U.S., in other words, the main part of the U.S., or even California, Oregon, Washington, the coastal states, you're not going to see a change. By the time you multiply with a load factor of 0.6 to compensate for strength design maps, it's not going to change significantly. So you're pretty much where you were before. When you get close to the hurricanes, you may go up or you may go down, depending on where the building is. If you're near the ocean, it's probably the uplift pressure is going to go up. If you're inland further, you may not even be in a hurricane-prone region anymore, so it'll go down. So it depends on where you are in the U.S. One other question, just one more, and that is the net effect when it comes to other organizations. Right now, everybody's been used to using ASCE 705 wind map, right? And in fact, if you look at FM Global, for instance, their definition of uplift pressure, the wind maps are identical. It's become very easy to say if I pass FM Global, it's going to be passing ASCE 7, because FM Global always used an importance factor of 1.15, just because they insure it. Is that going to be the case? I've talked to FM Global, and they've indicated they have no intention of changing the wind maps to the new ASCE 7, so there's going to be a difference. And you can understand why. FM Global is an insurer, and they're insuring the roof against blow-off. They're not in the structural design business. So you're not going to be, they're not as interested in the ultimate wind speeds. And they'll be using some portion, something like the old map in some way. How about ES1? That's now a combination of SPRI and FM Global. I doubt if they will change, other than the fact they may take a map and put the new contour lines on them and the old wind velocities. I'm not sure. You know, that's up for grabs. There's going to be changes. We've got wind calculation, uplift pressure calculators, both in RCA and SPRI. I would be surprised if they're not working on those now to make them consistent with ASCE 7, but I don't know. All I'm pointing out is that there's going to be a fair amount of confusion, because you're going to have to calculate both ASCE 7 according to their rules, ASCE 7-10, in order to comply with the International Building Code, and you're going to have to calculate FM Global, and you're going to have to calculate ES1 and other pressures using different wind speed maps, different categories, different definitions. So it's going to affect you. That's the major part of the differences between ASCE 710, now the new one, and the old. Any questions?
Yes, Jerry. When we're talking about a risk factor in the category 3 or 4 range, and that it is also affected by the glazing, but how are we to design a roof that where the pressures could be changed internally, that internal coefficient changed by the windows being blown out, which now relates to uplift pressures on our roof system? Now, who's going to be liable for that?
Yeah, there are going to have to be decisions made. The basic decision is whether you're going to be in risk category 3 or 4 or 2, and it affects wind-blown debris regions with blowout windows. It's going to affect wind speeds, you know, a lot of different things. And it's not clearly defined anymore, except if you've got a normal office building that's a decent-sized office building, you're going to put it in category 2. But when it comes to unusual buildings of any type, somebody's going to have to help with that decision. This is the way I look at it. Now, I could be wrong in the way you can make your best judgment and not talk to anybody, and that's up to you and your liability. Any other questions? Dave?
Mine is more of a comment, and it revolves around, you know, this this risk category, since it has gotten so fuzzy, that it would be incumbent on all of us, to look at our errors and omissions insurance carrier, get their input as to how they view our work in this arena, and then the assignment for any particular project for that risk category needs to be, that discussion with the building owner and the roof consultant, maybe even the building owner's insurance carrier, to say, we've got to make this and do this smart. Otherwise we may err on the side of conservancy, which means move everything to, to risk category 3 or 4, and I don't know that we actually do a service to our clients that way. So get clarification, get someone else, to make that decision. That may be the building owner and or the building owner's insurance carrier that makes that decision, buys into it.
That's very important, and you're just drawing more attention to the risks associated with the selection of a risk category map. So it's going to be important. Anybody else? Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.